So good evening. My name is Derek Scalia. I am the Associate Director of Student Involvement and the Director of Alana Diversity Programs at Pierce. And tonight, I want to have a conversation with you a little bit about how do we engage in the purpose of youth engagement in the democratic process. But before we get there, I want to explain a little bit of my background, how someone in student affairs is somehow engaged in the political process. So my political background started when I was 18 years old, working on Al Gore's campaign for president in 2000. And got only partially involved in that campaign, helping out in the offices, but realized like this is a real passion of mine. I really want to be working in electoral politics. So in 2004, as a college student here at my alma mater, Franklin Pierce, I got involved in the Dennis Kucinich for President campaign. And it was there where I learned a lot about what it's engaged. And I'll share a few stories about my involvement with media and the life lessons that I learned from there as we go on. But then in 2004, after us not receiving the nomination, worked on a few side campaigns, worked for Granny D for Senate. Does anyone here know about Granny D? All right, we got a few people in the back. So Granny D, at the age of 89, walked across the country, and her plan was to get money out of politics. She felt that the campaign finance system was, as it was operating, was corrupt. And she was supporting the major piece of legislation at that time, the McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform bill. And at 89 years old, about yay tall, and with emphysema, walked across the country, inspiring thousands and thousands of people to re-engage and find their connection in the political process. When she finally completed her walk, she ended in the U.S. Capitol, and there she read the Declaration of Independence, and then was arrested for reading the Declaration of Independence in the Congress. So a few years later, after her journey, there was a Senate race for U.S. Senate in New Hampshire, and the Democratic candidate withdrew in the middle of the election. And Granny D, at the age of 94, said, "I'll run." And I was like, that's a campaign I want to get involved in. And so I volunteered with her campaign operation. There's actually a great HBO documentary about it, which you should watch. But my favorite day was when Granny D was told, "You have to debate the current senator." And she says, "I don't want to debate the current senator. I want to have a conversation with him." We're like, "Well, you can in a debate." And she said, "I'd rather challenge him to a Scrabble tournament." And so it started having me think, like, the way in which we engage in politics is so cookie cutter that it keeps some people out from engaging that because we don't know where our place is within that political process. And so Granny D was starting, amongst thousands of others in the democratic experience of the United States, started to pave way for others to find a way in which we can have a conversation about issues that doesn't have to fit the typical mold. Granny D came in, I think there were like 8 weeks left before the election. She ended up getting 37% of the vote, or something close to that. She had none of the money, and she was 94. Her big campaign promise was, I will be a one-term senator, which U.S. Senate seat is for 6 years. And so, sadly, Granny D passed away at her 100th year birthday. But she was a real gem and a local hero from Dublin, New Hampshire, just up the road. After that campaign, I went back to the Dennis Kucinich for president in 2008 campaign, and there I was the regional coordinator for the Northeast, so oversaw New Hampshire and Maine and all the way down to New Jersey. Does anyone know how we did in that primary? We didn't do very well. We worked really hard. We ended up getting a 0.5% of the vote in New Hampshire. And so my political electoral experience is about finding those issues, finding what it is we're really striving for as a community, as a nation, and how does that represent within our view of as global citizens with one another. I decided to retire from electoral politics at that point and focus my energy on issue-based politics, advocacy work. And so I now work kind of consulting with others or engaging in movements fighting for disability rights, anti-poverty, anti-racism, and anti-gun violence issues tend to be where I'm going. And now in my capacity, both here at the university, helping direct the leadership programs, but outside on a path of ordination within the Episcopal Church, finding the way in which we can foster better ways of community and what are our responsibilities as a citizen. And we often think of that within the electoral process, to go out and vote, and then we go home. And I always tell my students and anyone that I'm working with that the most important day as a citizen in this country is the day after an election. You can vote, but if you just stop there, what's the point? We've just, washed our hands. We are the bosses of this and the stewards of this nation. It'd be like owning a McDonald's franchise and hiring the staff and then never showing up again until 4 years later. And then you realize the friolators are a mess and the whole place is just a disaster. And you sit there and be like, why didn't the employees do what they were supposed to? And I was like, we didn't show up for 4 years. Nothing happened. We didn't even show up to patron the place. We totally ignored it until 4 years later. Then we're like, maybe we need new staff. And we fight for it. So the day after the election is the day where you keep fighting for whatever you believe, because those elected officials need our guidance. They're representing us within the movement of change, or maybe they're working against what's needing to be happening in the community. So through my advocacy work, working with others, kind of developing a plan of action of how do we get to a core of our values. And this past election helped me really process that. How do we have conversations with others when we disagree with them? And I always had Granny D in the back of my mind of Scrabble. Now, I particularly can't stand Scrabble, so I wasn't going to challenge my neighbor who probably or definitely does have political differences than I. We weren't going to sit around there, but there's something that we care about, and we're both fathers, and we both really care about making sure that our daughters have access. And so it was an inroad there, and having that conversation. So how do we do that at a greater scale? I was talking with Kristen and Rich at dinner about how the system is made for us to become numb. And when we're numb, we lose our ability to engage. We don't have feeling anymore. The suffering of our brothers and sisters, either in our communities or in our state, elsewhere in the country or in the world, no longer seem to impact us because we've gotten accustomed to seeing suffering from others. Images, words, actions, they're all part of this. And so as we try to re-engage in our democratic responsibilities, I challenge individuals, how do we shed that numbness and feel? And it's a scary place because when you feel something, you have a responsibility. You can't just shed a tear, or you can't feel pride without engaging in those. And it's through conversations, it's through commitments and engaging with one another that we start to recognize the humanity in each other, regardless of what their political affiliations are. There's a campaign in, excuse me, in Keene there's little yard signs. I don't know if anyone has driven through Keene, but there are these blue signs that say all are welcome here. And of course, I was like, yeah, I want one of those. And I was out gardening with my daughter, and when I first got the sign, I was thinking, it's a recognition of those that have been marginalized, those that haven't had a place at the table, those that are being directly attacked. But there was this moment that I recognized that it's those individuals that I also disagree with are welcome here, even if I struggle to sometimes understand them. And I believe it's through youth and their responsibilities and engagement that is important within this process. In a lot of ways, you've been wronged. The system has defeated you before you even had a chance to engage. And that's there to perpetuate the status quo. And yet young people are yearning for something different. You guys have a civic responsibility that you feel to the environment. I see youth having great compassion for one another. It was the youth that really started to change the way in which individuals engaged with members of the LGBTQ community, that there was really this piece that you see each other. And what happens in our democratic process when you continue to see one another, when you see their responsibility and you engage in that? What sort of possibilities happen as a nation from that? And what are the impacts that happen where the United States is that shining city on a hill, and that you guys are the beacon of light in which people are looking for? So before we began here, I was talking a little bit about our ASB, or Alternative Spring Break program. And it's designed to give back, to learn, but to create empathy. Develop some space to where we learn something about the other that we didn't have a chance to. And so you can read in any book about the historical markers and timeline of the civil rights movement. But if you have no sense of the feeling of what it is like, or what it was like for individuals to engage in a movement for change, it's really hard to understand the importance of why that is part of the American experience, other than the basis of inclusion. And so students are often moved as they're marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, and they're transformed back to March of 1965. And they can visualize what it must be as they cross the crest of the bridge, and visualize a mob down there with the sole intent of causing harm. And yet, finding the courage to still persevere, to engage, and say, I believe in something. Every person, regardless of their political affiliation, that has gone on this, has said that they believe that they are finding a way in which they can engage something that they believe in so passionately that it's that moment that they can still stand there on that crest. Or they might stand in the downtown section of Montgomery, and there's this one spot right at the bottom of Dexter Avenue, and you can look up where the state capitol is, and it's where Dr. King gave his How Long, Not Long speech at the conclusion of the Selma to Montgomery March. But you come down, and there's this beautiful fountain down there. That fountain was where individuals were sold into slavery. And on one side of the street is where President Jefferson Davis gave the orders to fire and start the Civil War. And on the other side of the street, right there, is where Rosa Parks got on the bus and refused to give up her seat. And we always have a choice in life of whether we're going to stand on the side of the street to where we maintain the status quo and we don't see each other, or we might be on the other side of the street, that sometimes a simple act of no can transform who we are and how we see one another and change a nation. And so I have worked with youth in Keene and the surrounding area to tap into that place, that they feel an ownership, they feel a responsibility. They get these issues. There's a lot of people that say youth shouldn't be involved, they should be, having their childhood, which is true. There's a level of protecting them, but it's our job as mentors, speaking of my generation and above, to offer guidance so that they know how to solve problems, so that when they have the ability to engage in the process and electing individuals and holding them accountable, that they have the skills to learn how do you communicate, how do you have a conversation with someone that you disagree with and don't hate them, that you acknowledge them for their service, for what they're giving back, even when we struggle to understand what their motives may be. This is our responsibility as an older generation of engaging youth, providing those examples. Because if you don't have the examples, climate change continues to be an issue. Equality and pay continues to be an issue. Violence, all of these, the same issues cycle over and over and over again. Maybe, with your passion of not being numb and our guidance of how to engage, we might actually be on the cusp of creating real and sustaining change in our country. I've talked for a little bit and maybe was a little all over the place for some of you, but I wanted to kind of hear from you on what do you want to talk about? What do you have questions for me? I heard someone had a question of whether I'm related to the former Supreme Court Justice. Who was that? That's you? Mm-hmm. I am not, but there is a good story that goes along with it. When I was at a conference in 2001, we were in Washington, D.C., and we had to wear little name tags around it. And we had a whole morning free. And there was a Supreme Court case on whether police officers needed to obtain a warrant to use thermal imaging devices. And I said, wow, that's actually sounds like a very interesting case. So I show up to the Supreme Court, and you wait in line there, and they have seats designated for sitting through all the cases in the morning, but they also have the quick fast lane seats where there's you sit for 3 minutes. You sit down there, you hear a few of the lawyers talk, you might hear a few justices speak, and then they escort you out. So I have my badge on, and this Capitol Hill police officer comes up to me and he goes, are you related to the justice? And I said, yeah, he's my uncle. And he's like, really? I said, yeah, I was in town and just I wanted to go see the case. And he said, great. He's like, you know what, stay in this line, you'll be next in, just stay for the rest of the cases. So I'm like, score. I got the fast lane seats here, but I get to stay. Granted, there was only like 20 minutes left. And it was the most incredible experience. Anyone that can go to the Supreme Court must go. There's something about the intellectual discourse of these lawyers who come in with an argument, and within one question, a justice totally knocks down their argument, and that lawyer does not skip a beat. They just change direction and are arguing for their side in a totally different way. It's an amazing, amazing institution that we have. And I remember Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist at the end bang the gavel down so hard it echoed that you just rose out of fear from it, opposed to totally being lost in the drama of the case. Forgot to stand, but stood up out of the fear of the sound. I leave the Supreme Court, and I see the Capitol Hill police officer, and he goes to me. I was like, oh boy. And he goes, I know you're not related. And I was like, yeah. And he goes, family usually arrives 30 minutes before the trials. And I was like, oh, shoot. But it was nice that he let me in there. That was my only connection to the former Supreme Court justice. So a little deception sometimes can create new opportunities there. But as a whole, not wise advice. So, all right, so we must have some questions.
Okay, so you talked about how you go on a special break, the Montgomery, Alabama. Do you ever plan on going somewhere different?
Yeah.
Or do you plan have you been?
So this year, actually, we're going to the U.S.-Mexican border in Texas. We'll be working in Laredo, Texas, down there to talk to community members and find out about life on the U.S.-Mexican border. We have hopes of developing a relationship. I really want to go to coal country and work with individuals where their day-to-day life is changing. I grew up in a blue-collar house, and my father was a union worker for 27 years until his place of employment closed. He was 3 years away from retiring with full benefits from the union. No other place that was connected with the union would hire him because they said, you got 3 years, you're not going to stay here. So he took partial benefits, and he was laid off the day I graduated high school. And it's tough when you see kind of your way of life that you knew for so long just evaporate, and you don't know what the next opportunity is. My father never went off to college. It wasn't like he knew he was a warehouse worker. That was who he was. That was his identity. How often do we introduce ourselves? I introduced myself tonight by my title. And so how many Americans that are seeing this rapid shift in our economy losing their jobs? And they, people say, well, they cling to it. Well, they cling to it because it's who they are. It's how they provided for their families. It's the pride that they have there. And so want to work really in those communities to better understand what is life like as the world is changing so much, and our circle of importance, our priorities, which is often our families, you're holding on to that. You're wanting to protect that as much as you can. So we're looking for that. I also, outside of work, have done these trips with youth at my church and elsewhere. And I think that having experiential learning, we know, transforms individuals. We have students, when they go off on these programs, when I'm working with youth in the church, to live off of SNAP benefits, which are the supplemental nutrition programs, otherwise known as food stamps. To learn the struggles of what's it like to live off of $3.90 a day, to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And how do you feel at the end of the day after you have that? Now all of a sudden the story that you might have told yourself isn't what you're really experiencing. So it's those ways. It's not telling individuals how to feel. We're allowing them to feel and then have a dialogue of what have we learned, and engaging. What does the research tell us? What does the writing tell us? And what are we feeling? And are they in complement with one another? Or maybe they're not. And if they're not, why? What's happening here? So I hope that answered your question. Excellent. Other questions? Yes?
You mentioned that it's time for our generation to make a change.
Yeah.
What would you advise us to do in order to start doing that at our age?
Yeah. So reflect on those things that you care about, even if it's something in this finite moment. It doesn't have to be attaching to a movement or a particular issue. My journey weaved in and out. And then I realized electoral politics is, one, I've got the reverse Midas touch. If I work on a campaign, you're probably going to lose. So you better be fighting for a pretty darn noble cause there. But realized that I have the ability to work in communities on issues. And those issues have changed. Anti-poverty and anti-racism initiatives have always been at the core. Disabilities was through my work experience of working for an organization that worked with people with intellectual disabilities. And my wife works in that service field. Gun violence, that's a direct result of being a father. And it didn't make, I didn't really understand the personal connection until I held my daughter the first day that she was born. And you do anything to make sure that they're okay. And, hearing my daughter come home from her school saying, "Daddy, today we did a silent drill." And you sit there and say, wow, I grew up not doing silent drills. This is a weird state of life for my daughter. I don't want her growing up in that world. And I don't want it to be where we can't have an honest and civil conversation with one another, that we leave it to the responsibilities of the caretakers to protect. I think we can do better than that. So finding those points of what do you care about, and then find ways of what are you passionate about? What gifts do you have? Is it writing? Is it telling stories? Is it talking to people? Is it standing out in the cold rain holding up a sign? Because there's a place for those people. It's really important to have a public voice. I have stood in the most driving cold rains and been threatened, but there's a place to have a public voice there. So what is your talent and passion? But regardless of whatever it is, community is the most important piece. No change ever takes place in a vacuum. Even our most notable leaders that have transformed our nation had a team, had a movement, a community there. There's an old saying that Dr. King couldn't organize his way out of a paper bag. That was a quote by his lead organizer, Bayard Rustin, who organized the March on Washington, and he was the organizer there. And he did it without social media, which is pretty cool too. They didn't have Facebook that they could post being like, hey, we're all going to show up in Washington. We're going to listen to probably some of the coolest speeches that we'll all listen to for generations afterwards. They're calling up on the phone and using mimeographs, which is an old form of copiers, and distributing it elsewhere. So having community is important. And it's also sustaining, because the work is tough. You have great days where you can celebrate, and you have days to where you sit there and say, why am I doing this? I just want to go home. I just want to watch whatever cheap series on Netflix is and just binge watch it till the end of the series. But community sits there and says, I got your back. I'm there with you. I'll walk through those dark days. So, other questions? Yes?
So, how did you find your way to this job?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I was working in New Haven for this nonprofit that worked with people with intellectual disabilities, and my wife also worked there. We weren't married at the time, and I was feeling, I want to change, and I really wanted to move back to New Hampshire. Although I'm from Connecticut, I wanted to move back close to my alma mater. Luckily, my wife is from this area, and she was inclined to do that. Sometimes I'm an impulsive person, and this is probably one of the most impulsive things I did. I just left without really having a plan. And frankly, I'm not overly sure why she followed me, but she did. and I'm really grateful for that. And there was a job opening here, and I said, I wonder if this can be an opportunity for me to work with students to learn about their passions, but also help develop them to be leaders of conscience, to find their voice, and to move wherever they may go, be it political, be it liberal politics, conservative politics. Just find who they are and engage in that. But do it in a way that's holistic, that always sees the other person, and never, ever tries to demonize the other. We may criticize them, we may poke them a little bit, but at the whole, it's our responsibility to hold the other. So there must be other questions. Yes?
With so many different issues in the world, can you choose which ones to fight for?
Yeah, that's, I don't know. You can turn on the news, and you're just like, oh, I'm going to fight for this. I'm going to fight for refugees today. Oh, anti-torture, or, budgets. Nobody ever wants to fight for budgets, but budgets are probably the best thing to fight for. One of my heroes is a gentleman out of North Carolina named Reverend William Barber. And he's started the Moral Mondays movement down there. And he says, budgets are moral documents. It's what we say as priority. And, for me, it started to kind of say, okay, budgets are so dry. And you want to fight the fight that's sensational, and you're gonna go in and just give it all. But I started to realize, like, I'm feeling more inclined, like, wow, for every dollar, that's saying this is more important to us than this. And is that a reality for what's there? So, I don't know. I get caught up in the trap sometimes where you just feel like you're being pulled in the 50 different directions, and then other times when I take time to reflect, I realize I go back to my core. And it's working on those issues that see the other. I'm a big believer that all the issues are connected, that environmental justice and anti-racism and anti-gun violence and women's reproductive rights are all part of the same. And it's about creating a space to where all can live together. They can be seen, they're living in harmony, that there's not one that is trying to control for that. So I don't feel as bad when I get pulled in 30 different directions, but try to start out with one, and usually when you realize, oh boy, I have 50 there. So that wasn't really helpful advice, but it was probably honest advice. So, other questions? Yes?
What do you think is the single most important message you have for everyone?
So, I like to talk to my students about when we make decisions, we make them for a whole host of reasons, right? So if your parents call you out being like, why did you do that? And you'd be like, well, Susie was doing this, right? Like, it doesn't matter if it's a mundane piece, but you probably got at least 5, 6, 20 reasons on why you did that, right? So we're complicated human beings for that. Our reasoning is multifaceted. But when someone does something that we disagree with, how many justifications do we give that person? Maybe one. And it's because they're a jerk, usually, right? They did that because they hate me. Or they did that because they're selfish. And we never look at the complexity of that. And so what does life look like when we can look at the other person's decision-making as complex? And does that allow us an opportunity to have a conversation with them? We still may disagree with them on the whole host of reasons for it. But now we might also find ways in which we can agree. One of my favorite relationships in U.S. politics was between former Senator Ted Kennedy and Senator Orrin Hatch. These two guys did not see eye to eye. Ted Kennedy was was the flaming liberal in the chambers, and Orrin Hatch was the staunch conservative. And yet, those two got more things passed because they saw each other. And they knew that they weren't engaging in their advocacy for selfish reasons. They really were trying to create change. And so they formed a relationship, and they found, like, I'm not going to get everything I want, but I'm probably going to get somewhere to there. And you look at the number of bills, some of the most bills that impacted real change in people's lives have Ted Kennedy's and Orrin Hatch's name attached to them. When we stop having conversations, we end up in a political environment like we have now. That has been happening for the last 15, 20 years. Less and less conversations with one another, and more of just viewing the other as being selfish or evil. And often the case is it's neither. Any other questions? I don't even know how much time we have left. There must be. Yes.
What inspired you to go from working in politics and then all of a sudden coming into a job where you were fighting this type of issue?
Yeah, because electoral politics, you know, at the end of the day is pretty empty. It can be you win or you lose. I think it's why no matter who wins in November, you know, of a presidential year, you have people that just sit there and say, ugh. And they just, because they felt like during the entire political process that they were fighting this really great fight. And yet at the end of the day, the next day after the election, none of that stuff is a reality. None of the campaign promises are anything. Like, there's a process. We have a constitution that says, hey, we got chambers within our Congress. We have a court system here. Like, you need to enact legislation. And yet we're like, on November 8th, I know my candidate's going to do this. And then they get elected, and you're just like, oh, I don't know what to do. I have no way. And that's where the mentoring piece comes in. That's where we have failed as a people, that we haven't found our responsibility of teaching our children and teaching those that have not been part of the political process how to engage. How do you sustain your passion? If it's environmental rights, how do you advocate for that? Are you just going to wait till Earth Day in April and then hope for the next cycle around that you have a candidate? Probably not. I mean, it's not going to. You're going to feel pretty empty. And so I realized that going into work in which I can start to talk about leaders, and my work is not totally apolitical here. All of my advocacy is outside of work, but what I'm doing is planting the seeds of leaders, of having that responsibility towards others. So when they're engaging with their peers, how do they have it to where they recognize their peer? Some of those students take that and say, wow, I can transform this back into my political beliefs. Others take it and are solely focused on service-based lives. They go off and to AmeriCorps and Peace Corps, which are political unto themselves. Others take it into their business work. So there's ways in which we're fighting this battle of civility, of recognizing the other, no matter what path you choose to take it. So if your passion is business, great. Business could use a lot more civility within it. Our economic system could use civility to where people feel like they're seen by not only their employer, but kind of with it, their work is somehow fulfilling. I think we as a nation, we as a world are searching for that. We often feel unfulfilled. And it's mostly because someone hasn't recognized who we are. And we each have a story to tell, but we need someone to listen to that story. You have the ability to listen to that story.
Derek, one last question.
Sure.
I know that you have a little one.
I do.
And how are you engaging her in civic life?
So Natalie comes, my daughter's name's Natalie, and she is a force to be reckoned with, which is awesome, although sometimes I regret teaching my daughter to have a voice, because I have a responsibility to listen to that voice. But Natalie, for us, we try to, little kids are observant. Anyone that says, oh, well, we need to, protect and make sure that they have their childhood, there's nothing wrong with that. But our children also see the violence. They hear it in voices. They see it on television. Even when you try to control what they're watching, they somehow have this ability. I swear, my daughter, she finds weird things on YouTube sometimes. I'm like, I think that's like some Russian channel there. I'm like, what is going on? And then I put all the parameters on, but they have questions, and if we're not willing to at least have a dialogue with them, if we just say, you're a child, these are adult issues, no, they're human issues. One of the best advice that was given to me, and for the parents that are here, anytime you're a first-time parent, everyone has advice for you, on everything, what kind of food and stuff. But the best advice came from a person that I work with, that I contract events with on campus here. And he said, always treat your child like the human being that they are. Never treat them just like a child. And so when Natalie sees someone that's homeless, we talk about that. What are our responsibilities to make sure that our brothers and sisters have food, have an adequate place to sleep, that they're safe, and talk about what does it feel like when someone doesn't see us when we're hurting, and so really connecting her in with her emotions for that. We try to shelter her from images of violence, but they happen. But Natalie has come to demonstrations with me. Often we're very selective on where and how. So Natalie's all into, as she says, girl power. So the city of Keene was having Women's March, and so we, the day before, created superhero capes, and we were superheroes for each other, and we marched together because it was in our community. We knew it was her neighbors there, and she was delighted to see all the speakers, and all these women speaking. And she talked about it she still has her cape that was made out of tissue paper hanging up on her wall, and she has Superhero Day on Friday at her camp, and she's taking her cape and going to be her superhero for the. So, there are people that disagree with it, and there's a fine line between helping your child understand and engage in the process and propagating them for an issue. If your kid does not engage in that or doesn't find a connection for themselves, they shouldn't be there. It was important. She wanted to see. She has this cool book called, I think it's 100 Bedtime Stories for Rebel Girls. It's really cool. It's one of my favorite bedtime books to read to her. And she's just learning about all these really cool pioneers within their fields. And that's her thing. And so that's how we're connecting with it. But if she said, Dad, be quiet, I want to watch Sesame Street, have at it. I'll join you for it. So. Thank you. Thank you.
How old is Natalie?
She's 5. So, and she's crazy, but I love her.